In the winter of 1944, somewhere in the staging areas of the Pacific, a Marine Corps censor sat down with a stack of letters and a black marker. His job was straightforward. Remove anything that revealed position. Remove anything that indicated unit strength or movement. Remove anything that could tell the enemy what was coming and from where. What he left untouched, what passed through his office unredacted every single day, were the food references. Cornbread, sweet potato pie, mama's beans, the cow that needed milking, the garden that wanted tending. These passed. They always passed. Nobody in the censor's office thought food was classified information. Nobody understood yet that food was the most revealing thing these men were putting on paper, not about where they were or what they were doing, but about who they were and what specific version of America they were fighting 6,800 miles from home to return to. The letters that made it through are held now in archives, in family collections, in the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Read them together and a pattern emerges that no single letter contains alone. The food these men described was not generic, it was not interchangeable. It was the food of a specific place, a specific household, a specific immigrant kitchen or Depression-era table or mountain farm. Every man writing home carried a different America in his memory. Every man writing home was eating the same thing. On February 19, 1945, approximately 70,000 Marines landed on a volcanic island 8 miles long in the western Pacific. The island was called Iwo Jima. They came from Kentucky and Texas and Pennsylvania and New Hampshire and every other place that had sent its young men to the Pacific. They landed on a beach of black volcanic sand under fire that the men who survived it would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. And in their packs, in a wax-coated cardboard box, roughly the size of a large paperback novel, they carried the United States military's official answer to the question of what a human being needs to eat. It was called the K-Ration. It had been designed by a physiologist named Ansel Keys in 1941. It contained approximately 3,000 calories. It was intended to sustain life. It was never intended to resemble food that anyone had eaten before. What follows is 10 of the foods it replaced.
Cornbread. Franklin Sousley was 19 years old when he landed on Iwo Jima. He was from Flemingsburg, Kentucky, farming country in the eastern part of the state, where the land rolls up into the foothills of the Appalachians, and the Depression had arrived long before the stock market crash made it official for the rest of the country. His household's food was the food of rural Appalachia in the 1930s, not the romanticized version, the actual version, which was specific and coherent and built entirely around what a family could grow, preserve, and stretch through a winter. Cornbread was not a side dish in a household like Sousley's. That distinction matters. In the urban American food imagination, cornbread is something that arrives in a basket alongside a meal. In the food world Sousley grew up in, cornbread was the meal, or the foundation of it. It appeared at breakfast, at dinner, at supper. It was baked in a cast-iron skillet that had been seasoned over years of use until the surface was as smooth and black as the volcanic sand Sousley would one day land on. It was hoe cake cooked on a griddle, pone baked in the coals, skillet bread eaten hot with whatever fat was available. It was the caloric anchor of a diet built around cornmeal, dried beans, and salt pork, and it tasted like the specific combination of rendered lard and stone-ground meal and the mineral character of well water that existed in that particular kitchen and nowhere else. The K-Ration contained biscuits. They were compressed, shelf-stable, and designed to survive months in a wax-coated box through tropical heat and amphibious landings. Eugene Sledge, who fought in adjacent Pacific campaigns at Peleliu and Okinawa and wrote the closest thing to a primary source account of Marine ration experience in the Pacific Theater, described the K-Ration biscuits in terms that were clinical in their precision. They tasted, he wrote, approximately like the cardboard they arrived in. Multiple Federal accounts from the Pacific confirm this. The biscuits provided calories, they provided fiber, they provided a texture that reminded no one of anything they had eaten before the war. There is no clean analogy for what this replacement meant. The closest approximation is not culinary. It is the difference between a photograph of someone's face and the face itself. Both contain the same information, roughly. Only one of them is the thing. Franklin Sousley died on Iwo Jima on March 21, 1945. He had been in the photograph for 26 days. He was 19 years old. Salt pork and fatback. Before refrigeration reached rural America, which for most of the country outside major cities meant sometime in the 1930s and 1940s if it arrived at all, fresh meat was a seasonal event. You slaughtered in the fall. You ate fresh through November. Then you preserved what was left, or you went without until the following year. Salt pork was not a choice made from preference, it was technology. You packed the meat in salt, and it lasted through the winter. The fat, the fatback, the side meat, the pieces that were more white than pink, you rendered into lard that became the cooking fat for everything else on the table. You seasoned your beans with it. You fried your cornbread in it. You put it in the pot with your collard greens and let it cook until the flavor had moved from the meat into the liquid and from the liquid into everything the pot contained. The men who ate this food growing up were eating the food of scarcity. A significant portion of the Marines who landed on Iwo Jima came from households where this was the year-round protein reality, not occasionally, not as a flavor accent, but as the primary form in which meat appeared at the table. For these men, the smell of salt pork rendering in a pan was the smell of every morning that had ever felt like home. The K-Ration meat tins contained chopped ham and eggs, veal loaf, processed pork luncheon meat, and a beef and pork mixture that the Quartermaster Corps documentation listed without further elaboration. Veterans across the Pacific Theater described these tins with a consistency that suggests they were encountering the same problem from different directions. The contents were technically meat, they had the approximate color of meat, and under some conditions the approximate texture. They had been processed, combined, salted, and sealed in a tin at a facility that was producing hundreds of thousands of units per week. What they didn't have, what the manufacturing process could not produce, was any relationship to the smell, the fat behavior, the specific flavor compounds that developed when salt pork met a cast iron pan and rendered slowly over a low fire. The gap between those two things is not a gap of quality, it is a gap of kind. One of them was food, the other one was fuel.
3. Pie. Read enough WWII Pacific correspondence and a pattern emerges that is almost statistically reliable. Pie appears with a frequency that no other specific food matches. Not a particular variety, apple pie and letters from New England and the Midwest, sweet potato pie in the South, peach pie from the Carolinas and Georgia, cherry pie from the Great Lakes, sugar cream pie from Indiana. The specific variety shifted with region and family tradition. The word itself appeared everywhere. This was not coincidence, and it was not sentimentality. Pie occupied a specific position in the domestic architecture of Depression-era America. It was the thing that required skill to make, the crust that took practice to produce, the filling that required judgment about sweetness and consistency, the timing that came from years of knowing a particular oven's behavior. Pie was the emblem of the kitchen at its most accomplished. When men wrote home about pie, they were writing about the specific knowledge of a specific person, a mother, a grandmother, a wife, who had learned to make it from someone who had learned from someone before them. The pie was the person. You could not separate them. The K-Ration contained a chocolate bar. It was called the Logan Bar, named for Colonel Paul Logan of the Quartermaster Corps. Ansel Keys, who designed the K-Ration, gave the manufacturer a specific instruction when he commissioned it.
The bar should taste, he wrote, only slightly better than a boiled potato. He was precise about this. If the chocolate tasted good, if it tasted like the chocolate a soldier had eaten before the war, the men would eat it as a treat rather than holding it as an emergency caloric reserve. So Keyes specified it be formulated to resist that impulse, resistant to melting in tropical heat, dense enough to provide sustained energy, and calibrated deliberately to bring no pleasure. Somewhere in the censored mail, a man described the pie he was coming home to. In his pack, in a wax-coated box, was a bar of chocolate that had been specifically engineered not to remind him of anything good. Both were sweet. That was the only thing they had in common. 4. Pinto beans and corn tortillas. Harlan Block grew up in Weslaco, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, where the river was a geographic fact more than a cultural divide, and the food on the table reflected that reality with complete honesty. Pinto beans, corn tortillas made from masa, dried chilies, beef when it was available, which was not always, a diet with deep roots in the Mexican-American food culture of the border. Not a cuisine encountered at restaurants, but the daily food of a household that cooked the same things his neighbors cooked and their neighbors cooked, in a community where this food was simply what food was. The slow-cooked pinto bean is a specific thing. You start it in the morning. You add lard, dried chilies, maybe an onion, salt at the end when the beans are already soft. You cook it for hours. The liquid thickens, and the beans absorb it, and by the time the meal arrives, the pot contains something that is technically beans and water, but which tastes of nothing that either of those words individually suggests. The corn tortilla you make fresh, pressing the masa by hand or with a press, cooking it on a comal until it blisters in exactly the pattern that tells you it's done. These were not difficult techniques, they were practiced techniques, the difference between knowing how to do something and having done it 10,000 times. There was no version of this food in the military supply chain, not a degraded version, not a substitute with the same flavor profile, nothing. The K-Ration processed meat tins contained pork, veal, and ham products sourced from Midwestern packing houses. The biscuits were made from refined wheat flour. There were no dried chilies anywhere in the Iwo Jima supply chain, no masa, no lard cooked beans. The military had not approximated Block's food and fallen short. It had not attempted it. His food existed entirely outside the framework within which the K-Ration had been designed. Harlan Block died on Iwo Jima on March 1, 1945, day 10 of the battle, 6 days after the photograph. He was 21 years old. 5. Kielbasa and rye bread. The coal and steel towns of western Pennsylvania were not built by people whose families had been in America for generations. They were built by people who had arrived from Central and Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: Czech, Slovak, Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Italian, recruited by the mills and the mines because they would work for wages that established American workers had stopped accepting. They brought their food with them. In the specific geography of the mill-town neighborhood, that food survived. Michael Strank was born in Conemaugh, Pennsylvania, to a Czech immigrant family. He grew up eating the food of that kitchen: kielbasa, pierogies, stuffed cabbage rolls, beet soup, rye bread with a crust that required a serrated knife and a density that could sustain a man through a 10-hour shift underground. This food required knowledge. The kielbasa required specific seasoning: garlic, margarine, black pepper, and specific technique in the smoking. The pierogies required the dough knowledge that came from making them weekly for years. The rye bread required an understanding of fermentation that could not be compressed into a recipe card. This was a food culture that existed in Strank's household because his mother carried it from Czechoslovakia and had been practicing it since before he was born. The K-Ration biscuit was the universal bread. It had no relationship to rye bread, not to its sourness, its density, its specific interior texture, the way it behaved under a knife.
The processed meat tins had no relationship to kielbasa, not to its fat content, its smoke, the particular combination of garlic and marjoram that made it smell like the specific kitchen it came from. The K-Ration was the most culturally generic food ever engineered. The immigrant table was among the most culturally specific food worlds in Depression-era America. Between them was a distance that calories could not measure. Strank was the oldest of the flag raisers, 25 at Iwo Jima, a sergeant who had enlisted before Pearl Harbor, who had been in the Corps long enough to understand what the landing was going to cost. He reportedly told the men in his squad before the assault that if they were killed, at least they wouldn't have to watch him die. The squad survived. He did not. He died on March 1, 1945, the same day as Harlan Block. 6. Tourtière and soupe aux pois. Manchester, New Hampshire was a mill city, textile mills along the Merrimack River that had drawn French-Canadian workers south from Quebec for 3 generations by the time René Gagnon was born there in 1925. The French-Canadian community in Manchester maintained its food culture across those generations with a consistency that reflected how thoroughly the community had maintained itself in general. You ate what your mother made because your mother ate what her mother made, and the chain connected Manchester in 1945 to Quebec in 1885 without significant interruption. Tourtière is a meat pie, pork, sometimes beef and pork together, seasoned with cinnamon and cloves and allspice in a combination that has no parallel in Anglo-American cooking, and which produces, when baked, a smell that is entirely specific to this tradition. It was eaten at Christmas, at New Year's, on Sundays when the family gathered. Soupe aux pois, split pea soup, thick with salt pork, the daily staple that stretched ingredients through the week, was the daily food. Dense enough to be a meal on its own. The kind of thing that tastes like what it is, which is a dish designed by people who understood cold winters and the specific caloric requirements they created. The K-Ration supper unit contained a pressed meat product in a tin. A meat product pressed into a tin is, by the loosest structural definition, a kind of pie, an ingredient inside a container. The distance between that description and tourtière is the distance between the word and the thing. One was made in a factory that produced 100,000 units per day by workers who had never tasted it. The other was made in a kitchen on a Sunday morning by a woman who had been making it since before her son was born, who seasoned it by memory rather than measurement, who knew it was done not by the timer but by the smell. Gagnon survived Iwo Jima. He came home to Manchester. The food was still there. What the war had done to the man eating it is a different question, and one the video does not have the standing to answer. Fresh milk. There is a category of absence that does not announce itself because it is the absence of something that was never dramatic to begin with. Fresh milk is in this category. Not milk as an ingredient in something else, milk as a glass, cold, from a refrigerator or a spring house, or directly from the neighbor's cow, still warm and tasting of the specific pasture the animal had been standing in. Pacific Theater correspondence references cold, fresh milk with a frequency that rivals pie, and the two cravings are related. Both are domestic. Both are specific to a particular moment in the architecture of a day. The glass of milk with supper, the glass of milk before bed, the milk that appeared as a matter of course in a household where it was simply available. Men who had never thought specifically about milk as food missed it specifically when it was gone. Fresh dairy did not exist at the Iwo Jima front. The heat, the distance from supply, the absence of refrigeration in the assault lines, these eliminated it entirely. The K-Ration contained no dairy component. Powdered milk existed in the military supply chain, but was not distributed in the assault rations carried by the men landing on the beach. For the duration of the battle, the men on Iwo Jima went without anything that functioned as dairy.
This is a small fact. It is also, read against the letters, not a small fact at all. The water problem deepened the absence. The volcanic groundwater on Iwo Jima was sulfurous and frequently undrinkable. Fresh water had to be shipped to the island and rationed once it arrived. The Marines were thirsty in a specific way, not merely dehydrated, but denied every liquid that tasted like the particular places they came from. Well water in Kentucky, spring water in Texas, tap water in Manchester. The water they had grown up drinking without thinking about what it tasted like, because when water tastes like where you are, you don't notice it. You only notice it when it's gone. The letters asked about the cow, the garden, the cellar, the well. Not just the food, but the systems that produced food, the land, the labor, the generational knowledge that made the table possible. What the letters were asking, in the language available to them, was whether the world that had made them was still there. The K-Ration came from a factory in New Jersey. The factory was still there. That was not what they were asking about. 8. Collard greens and pot liquor. The Montford Point Marines are not in the photograph. They were the first Black Marines in United States history, trained beginning in 1942 at Montford Point Camp, North Carolina, a segregated facility separate from the white Marine training camps, where approximately 20,000 black men were trained during the war. At Iwo Jima, they served in ammunition and depot companies. They unloaded ships under fire. They hauled shells forward to the assault companies. They worked in the logistical infrastructure that made the battle possible, while the assault went forward above them. They were under the same Japanese artillery. They were on the same volcanic sand. The flag that went up on Suribachi flew over a segregated military. The food they were fighting to return to was, in significant part, the same food that appears in Portrait 1 of this video. Collard greens cooked low and slow with salt pork until the leaves had given up everything they contained into the pot. Cornbread, black-eyed peas, sweet potato. The food of the Black South and the food of Appalachia shared deep roots, the same preserved meats, the same legumes, the same techniques for making a scarce ingredient sustain a large household through a season. They shared those roots because they shared a history, divided by the specific facts of American racial geography into traditions that were related and officially unacknowledged as such. The pot liquor is worth a moment. It was the liquid left in the pot after the collard greens had finished cooking, dark, salt pork rich, carrying the concentrated flavor of everything that had cooked in it for hours. Southern households drank it, dipped cornbread in it, gave it to children because it contained nutrients that Depression-era nutritional science was only beginning to quantify. It was the part of the meal that lasted longest, the flavor of the greens, the fat of the pork, the mineral character of the cooking water, all reduced and combined into something that was, in practical terms, as close as this food tradition came to a sauce. The K-Ration contained no equivalent, not even a structural approximation. The bouillon cube in the dinner unit, a compressed cube of sodium and dried vegetable extract that dissolved in hot water, was the ration's closest gesture toward a cooking liquid. The distance between bouillon and pot liquor is not a distance of quality, it is a distance of intention. One was designed to provide sodium and the illusion of warmth. The other was the last thing the pot had to give. The Marine Corps was desegregated by executive order in 1948, 3 years after Iwo Jima. The Montford Point Marines who survived came home to a country that had not yet formally resolved what they were owed by it. The video notes this and moves on. The documented record is sufficient. Real coffee. The K-Ration breakfast unit contained a packet of soluble coffee, a powder designed to dissolve in warm or cold water that provided caffeine and approximately nothing else. Veterans across every theater of the war document the experience of the soluble coffee with a consistency of response that suggests they were all encountering the same absence from different directions. It was caffeinated.
When water was available to heat it, it was warm. It had no smell, it had no body. It sat in the tin cup like colored water and tasted like the memory of coffee rather than the thing itself. Coffee in Depression-era America was a ritual before it was a beverage. The percolator on the stove going before anyone was awake. The smell that moved through the house while the household was still getting dressed. The weight of the pot, the particular sound of the percolation, the color of the liquid against the white of the cup. These were the textures of the specific morning that the coffee belonged to. Not any morning. The morning in that kitchen, in that house, where the coffee was made by whoever made it and tasted the way it tasted because of the water and the grounds and the particular pot that had been in use since before the man writing the letter was old enough to drink from it. Coffee crossed every regional and cultural line in this video. The cornbread was Appalachian. The tourtière was French-Canadian. The tepary beans were Pima. Coffee was everywhere. Every household in Depression-era America had a coffee pot. The smell of it in the morning was the smell of morning in any American home, regardless of what language was spoken at the table, or what food appeared on it, or what church the family went to, or what country the grandparents had come from. It was the single most universal daily ritual in the letters, which is why it appears here in the 9th portrait as the bridge between everything that came before it and what comes next. Men wrote home asking their families to have coffee ready, not as a specific request, as a statement about what they were coming back to, as a way of saying, I know the exact morning I am returning to, and I know what it smells like, and I know where I will be standing when I drink it. The soluble powder in the wax-coated box was the only coffee available on Iwo Jima. They drank it anyway. They drank it because it was caffeinated and they needed to be awake. They drank it because there was nothing else.
Tepary beans and sawato fruit. Every portrait in this video describes a gap between a familiar American food and what the military supplied to replace it, a degraded version, a manufactured approximation that preserved the caloric function while losing the flavor, the ritual, the cultural specificity of the original. The gap in each portrait is real and it is wide, but it is a gap between two things that at least exist in the same universe of American industrial food production: salt pork and processed meat, rye bread and compressed biscuits, real coffee and soluble coffee, the original and the approximation. Ira Hayes was from Socatan, Arizona. He was Pima, Akimel Oodam, a member of one of the oldest agricultural peoples in North America, whose ancestors had been farming the Sonoran Desert for centuries before anyone arrived to tell them what farming was. His traditional food was the food of that landscape: tepary beans, small, drought-resistant, intensely flavored, domesticated by the Pima and their ancestors over millennia, growing in the desert conditions where nothing else grew. Saguaro fruit, harvested from the giant cacti of the Sonoran Desert in late June, with poles made from the dried ribs of dead saguaros, fermented into a ceremonial drink, dried into cakes. Cholla buds, mesquite pods ground into flour, foods that required not just agricultural knowledge, but a deep intimacy with a specific landscape, knowledge of where the plants grew, when they were ready, how to process them, what they meant in the context of the ceremonies that surrounded their harvesting. None of this existed in the military supply chain. The point is not that the K-Ration failed to approximate tepary beans. The point is that tepary beans were not within the framework the K-Ration had been designed within. The system that produced the K-Ration was American industrial food production, Midwestern packing houses, wheat flour mills, chocolate manufacturers in the Northeast. It was a system that had been built over the preceding century on the food cultures of European immigrants and their descendants. It had a horizon. Tepary beans were beyond it. The food Ira Hayes had grown up eating did not exist in any form within American commercial food production in 1945. It was not a degraded version that survived somewhere. It was simply absent, outside the system entirely. Hayes enlisted in the Marine Corps from the Pima Reservation. He went through boot camp, through training, through the staging areas, through the landing on Iwo Jima. He was in the patrol that climbed Suribachi on February 23rd. He helped raise the second flag. He survived the battle. He came home to Sakatan. The saguaro was still growing when he returned. The tepary beans were still planted in the fields that the Pima had been cultivating in the Sonoran Desert for centuries. The land had not changed. He died in 1955. He was 32 years old. The video does not explain what the war did to him. The dates are sufficient.
The K-Ration approximately fed 70,000 men on Iwo Jima. It kept them alive through 36 days of combat, whose intensity the military's own official histories describe in terms that strain against the available vocabulary. It did what it was designed to do, completely and without failure. The engineers at the Quartermaster Corps knew it would be despised. The design documents acknowledged this directly. The palatability of the ration was deliberately subordinated to its portability, its shelf stability, and its caloric density. They designed it to be tolerated, not enjoyed. They made that choice because the alternative was a ration too heavy to carry and too fragile to survive a Pacific landing. They were right to make it. What the ration could not carry, what nothing manufactured in a facility producing 100,000 units per day could carry, was the specific knowledge of what a particular family's table had tasted like for 20 years. It could not carry the cast iron skillet that had been seasoning in a Kentucky kitchen since before the man eating the biscuits was born. It could not carry the smell of the percolator. It could not carry the recipe that existed in a woman's hands rather than on paper, the knowledge that had moved from one generation to the next through the act of cooking together until it no longer needed to be said aloud. It could not carry the landscape, the desert that had shaped what a man understood food to be, because the food had grown from that desert and nowhere else. The men on Iwo Jima were not one people. They came from every America that existed in 1945, the Appalachian farm, the border town, the immigrant mill neighborhood, the French-Canadian mill city, the Black South, and the Sonoran Desert. The K-Ration made them, for the duration, identical in what they consumed. This was logistically necessary. It was also, read against the letters that passed the censor's office, a kind of erasure whose scale only becomes visible when you look at what it replaced. The letters asked about the food. The food was still there for most of them, waiting in the kitchen, in the garden, in the specific pot that had been making the same thing for decades. For a few of the men, the food was there, but the man who had eaten it was not. For one of them, the food was there, and the man came home to it and stayed for 10 years and then was gone. The letters passed through the censor's office because nobody thought food was dangerous information. Nobody thought food could tell you anything important about the men who were fighting. They were wrong about that. The food told you everything.